In our world of free trade, you become internationally competitive not by increasing productivity, but by lowering wages. And when you lower wages, you reduce demand. And ultimately, if demand doesn't increase, production doesn't increase. I would argue that a reversal, at least a partial reversal of the current globalization process, what Danny Roderick, one of my favorite economists, refers to as hyperglobalization, would actually increase global production. The problem is that it isn't solved because of tariffs or anything like that. We need to be much more intelligent. But we have to think about how this game ends. The way the world works right now, the US, because of its open capital markets, is necessarily the consumer of last resort, not because it wants to be, but because as long as it has open capital markets and as long as people prefer to park their excess savings in the US, and roughly half of all the excess savings in the world are parked in the US, and much of the rest is parked in England, Canada, and Australia, all of which have very, very similar financial markets. But as long as that happens, then the US is forced to be the absorber of deficient demand abroad. Now, when the US was 50% of the world, this wouldn't have been a problem. The US today is still very large. It's about 24% of the world. But if you believe that the rest of the world will grow faster than the US, that means the US has to bear a bigger and bigger and bigger burden until eventually we see a collapse. I think long before that, something will happen. And the way I see it, there are two things that can happen, one good and one bad. The good thing is that we reconvene a Bretton Woods type negotiation in which countries get together and replan, redesign the global trade and capital regime along the lines that Keynes said at Bretton Woods. We didn't follow Keynes's model, unfortunately, in my opinion, but that's the basic model we follow, in which basically imbalances can't exist because there will be pressure on surplus countries, which is where the imbalances originate, pressure on surplus countries to resolve their imbalances domestically. So that would be the good way. Then we would have a globalized world under much better trading rules. The more likely way, unfortunately, is that the US eventually decides it refuses to bear the cost of this deficient global demand, and it unilaterally imposes, I would argue, capital controls. Some people would argue trade controls, we'll see, but it unilaterally imposes these controls on trade, where it forces the current account deficit to drop very, very rapidly. Now, that could be done in a very disruptive way, but if it's done in a smooth way, it would benefit the US. But it would be devastating for countries that rely on the US market, because I assume if the US did that, England and Canada and Australia would do it too. It would be devastating for countries that rely on those markets to resolve their domestic demand imbalances. Germans simply do not consume. Europeans do not consume what Germany produces. They're not paid enough. So if Germany can no longer run a trade surplus, what can it do? Quickly, all it can do is cut production very rapidly, which means a surge in unemployment. The same thing with China. What can it do if the world won't accept its surpluses? Well, the only thing it can do quickly is a surge in unemployment, or it can go crazy and spend money on building, bridges on top of bridges on top of bridges as a way of absorbing that domestic demand. But Germany doesn't have a debt problem, but China already does. That's not a very good solution. To me, it's sort of inevitable. We're moving in that direction. I would prefer a new Bretton Woods. I'm enough of a realist to suspect it's going to be very hard to do that. And so we will probably have unilateral moves by countries like the US and the UK, in which they force an elimination of trade imbalances. The shortcut, the cheap shortcut to becoming, very knowledgeable about economics is to read tons of history. And those of us who are, I think I'm referring only to myself here, those of us who are a little older will remember exactly the same movie coming out about Japan. I mean, it was very, very similar in the 1980s. And these movies were, fairly simple. They tried to explain Japanese and US trade imbalances and the huge surge in Japan as a result of cultural factors. And in retrospect, we now know that the huge surge in Japan in the 1980s was nothing to do with cultural factors. It was just a huge, perhaps the worst bubble of all time. And Japan has spent the last 20, 30 years trying to resolve it. So, I think these things are fun. I think they're important because they affect the political debate. I don't think they're terribly useful. I think, I think it's, I don't want to oversimplify, but I think if you look at, I'm going to sound like a Marxist here, but if you look at the economic substructure, you get most of the rest of it correct. You don't need, you don't need cultural differences between Americans and Chinese to explain what's happening in either country. Yeah, I've been in China for 20 years, and it's always been the case that within 5 years it'll be a major reserve currency, and it hasn't. It's barely moved. In fact, if you adjust its share of global trade for the size of the economy, what's really shocking about China is not how important it's becoming or the renminbi, but just how incredibly unimportant it is. It's on par with the Canadian dollar or the Mexican peso. And there's a reason for that. The renminbi is never going to become, or at least not for many decades, and not without a very significant political change, which I obviously don't want to discuss. It cannot become a major reserve currency. And the reason is quite simple. If you want to have a major reserve currency, if you want to have one of the really important ones, you need to have a very large economy. Okay, great. China has a large economy. You need to give up control of your capital account. You need to give up control of your current account. You need to be able and willing to run huge current account deficits. And you need to give up control of your financial system. And there is absolutely no evidence that Beijing wants to do any of those things. When you talk to politicians and military people, they say, yes, we want the renminbi to be a major currency because of all the political benefits that brings us. It does bring political benefits, but at huge economic cost. And Beijing has made it very, very clear that they do not want to pay any of those economic costs. And so that's why, even at the PBOC, at the People's Bank of China, when people talk about the renminbi becoming a major reserve currency, you can tell that they're saying it mostly because they're supposed to say it. They don't really believe it. And they don't really believe it because they understand what reserve currency status, what a global trading currency status means. Maybe, the latest data suggests that renminbi represents about 2.7% of international currency trade. Maybe they'll go up to 3.5%. We heard exactly the same talk about the Japanese yen. And I think I think Japan is about 3 or 4% today.
Yeah, the yen's higher. Yeah, the yen and the pound are both significantly higher. The British pound, I mean, that's not a major economy.
Yeah, 40 years later, the yen still has. If you read books in the 1990s talking about the currency regime of the 21st century, I guarantee you they will all say in the 21st century, there will be 2, maybe 3 major currencies, the US dollar, the Japanese yen, and maybe the European currency. Nobody says that anymore. And I think it's because in order to become a major traded currency, you have to give up a lot of things that Japan was unwilling to give up and that China is certainly unwilling to give up. The real gap is not between different groups of people. Common prosperity attempts to address that. I think it won't work, but that's not the problem. The problem in China is that whereas in most countries, households retain 65 at the bottom to 80% at the top of GDP, in China, it's 55. And the counterbalance, businesses retain 20 to 25, which is roughly in line with most countries. The real distortion in China is that the government retains about 20 to 25% of GDP. Now, in some Scandinavian countries, you see that too, but government income is redirected through the social welfare system to the household sector. In China, it's not. It's redirected into investment, basically to increase or to maintain savings, not to increase consumption. So we know what the solution is. It's just arithmetic. You've got to transfer money from local governments to the household sector. The problem, as I said earlier, is that's politically incredibly complicated and almost certainly requires significant, let's call it institutional reform. So it's very hard to do. Very few countries have been able to do it. Japan had to rebalance, and we started to see a partial rebalancing in the 1990s, and then it stalled out. And it's not a coincidence that Japan still hasn't grown. They've never been able to rebalance, even though they've been talking about it for years, about raising the consumption share of GDP. It's just been incredibly difficult to do.